Hello, Vikings. All right, today we're talking about Unit 4, Topic 8, which is all about ideology and policy making. So I asked the students, what's policy? What's policy making? Who's involved in policy making? And so basically policy is just the set of laws, the rules, the guidelines that we live by. All kinds of policies we have to deal with. We have to deal with school policies, dress code policies. Someone brought up a return policy. Basically, if you buy something from a store, some of them have rules and regulations on when you can return it or how it gets returned, basically. Policy making is basically just building those processes, building those rules, or in a lot of times policy making we look at as writing laws, basically, national laws that affect our lives and affect and impact society. So who's involved in it? So a couple great answers today. In fact, a couple people shared everyone should be involved with it. And I totally agree 100%. We all have the ability in this democracy to be able to be involved in all levels of the policymaking process. Even though if we're maybe not directly an elected official, it doesn't mean, we still maybe get a vote, or even if we're not a citizen, there's still different ways that we can get involved with protest and other kinds of messaging campaigns and stuff like that. But probably the most important influencers of national policy would be the Congress, because they write the laws. Also, the president executes or enforces the laws. And then you have the Supreme Court, which interprets the laws, basically. So let's jump into our lecture for policy making. Our learning objective for today is to explain how U.S. political culture influences the formation, goals, and implementation of public policy over time. So it's important to remember that this is not a strict U.S. history course. There's no level of expectations of you to memorize U.S. history or remember who was president when or what policies were issued then. But it is a good idea to just have a base of understanding about what was happening in the last century, just so you can better understand and create examples to just better explain yourself if you had to, like in a free response question. So I asked the students to analyze this table. We kind of shared out what we saw in the table and then how would what we see in the table affect policymaking during this era. This was some people call this the Democratic dominance era, where Democrats heavily controlled the policymaking process because they controlled the presidency most years and both houses of Congress, basically. So what that meant was that they were heavily in control of those policies, basically, of those national laws that were being created. And so they have much more of a liberal bent to them, increasing Social Security, Civil Rights Act of 1964, trying to ensure voter equality with the 24th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act, building government systems to support healthcare for Medicare and Medicaid. Also, a lot of liberal Supreme Court era rulings during that time to expand civil rights and the power of the federal government. So more recently, we've been dealing in an era of kind of like divided government, basically. So that chart on the right you can see is basically showing you, again, the president and then the Senate and the House. The R stands for Republican, the D stands for Democrat. And what we see is that most years you see that there's not a solid blue or red line. There are a few years where that's maybe a trend that I would notice, that it seems like we've been dealing more so with a lot of divided government lately, basically. Okay, and so in this era, we've seen the Republican Party has been much stronger and much more influential during policymaking process. A lot of tax cuts that were happening during this time that supports that idea of the conservative ideology of like lower taxes and smaller government, basically. So party platforms are basically just a set of beliefs that are just kind of accepted of like what the party stands for. And the party platforms are officially written by the parties every 4 years. They present them at their national convention, basically. And so they're updated to reflect, because as society changes, new issues come up. Some issues aren't as big of a deal anymore, so they're not needed to be included in the platform. But basically, it's just kind of a set of goals, a set of policies, a set of what they're striving for as far as influencing government. So, for example, in the Republican Party platform, there's always discussion about a belief in small government and always trying to lower taxes. And often the Democratic Party platform will include discussions or wishes for a larger government and increased social welfare programs. So liberals and conservatives, again, the big key differences between them, first, how they vote by party. Liberals are way more likely to vote Democrat. Liberals generally support the larger, more active government. They believe in Keynesian economic theory. They generally support social welfare programs and affirmative action. And they generally favor increased government regulation of businesses and the economy. And when it comes to social policy, they generally hold strong social views in favor of the right to have an abortion and the right for same-sex couples to marry. Conservatives are just the opposite. They are likely to vote Republican. As opposed to liberals, they want a smaller, less active government. They believe in supply-side economic theory. They generally don't support social welfare programs and affirmative action. And they generally favor reduced regulation of businesses and the economy. And they generally hold strong social views against abortion and same-sex marriage. So there's always a balancing dynamic between individual liberty and government stability in that, of course, we all want to be free. We all want to have lots of freedoms, but we also recognize that the reason we have government is because we need some sort of social order, basically. And so many of our policy debates center around this as far as what's the appropriate level of government authority and then what's the appropriate level of freedoms that we should have, basically. And so right now we're dealing with our pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's also a debate that has emerged that kind of does relate to ideology, and that's the mask debate, basically. We're not seeing this in a lot of other countries, but recent polls have demonstrated that political ideologies do have an effect on your likelihood of wearing a mask. That Democrats are more likely to be accepting of mask mandates and wearing a mask, whereas Republicans tend to be more likely to reject wearing a mask and being forced to follow that sort of policy, a mask mandate. And when asked why, when pollsters asked, well, why don't you like to wear a mask, for those that answered that they didn't like to wear one, freedom of choice not to was almost 50% of the poll, basically saying, okay, this is really why we don't really want to see masks, because I should have the choice not to. I should have the freedom not to, basically, would be their argument. And so this is no different. You know, history repeats itself. And so we saw a lot of this similar stuff happening in 1918, government spreading information basically about the influenza and how they can protect themselves. People basically honoring the mask wearing mandates and then even promoting, you know, wear a mask, go to jail. So in that part of society, basically there was not only a mask mandate, but a penalty of jail time if you didn't follow it. But then also there were people back then that resisted wearing masks and resisted that kind of government control, basically. So that is a newspaper article on the left-hand side, which is basically an anti-mask meeting advertisement to try to get people to discuss that. So authoritarian is basically just when you favor like strict obedience and you like lots of rules, basically. Some governments are more authoritarian where they have lots of rules and regulations. Some governments are a little bit more libertarian where they have more freedoms and don't try to put all these controls on people in society, basically. And so some libertarians criticize any kind of rules and stuff that they feel like are excessive. They sometimes refer to it as the nanny state, basically, in just referencing just basically, well, you know, you're trying to treat us like our grandmother or you're like our nanny and you have all these rules on us, basically. And so they'll kind of tend to reject that. And nanny state basically is a criticism or rejection of those types of policies and those types of laws. So libertarian is basically just a political philosophy that emphasizes freedom and liberty as their core principles. Really, you know, they're not total anarchists, so they do believe that government does have a role, but mostly just in the protection of private property, basically. And so there's a political compass test that you can take that will put you on both the left-right scale, but also the authoritarian-libertarian scale, basically. Are you more of an authoritarian? Are you more accepting of government's rules? Or are you more of a libertarian where you want some more freedoms in your society and choice around that? So libertarians, like I said, they're not left, they're not right, and they say just free, basically. Above all else, there's some things that make a libertarian more like a liberal. There's some things that make a libertarian more like a conservative, basically. So they are their own ideology. I would say above all else, they praise freedom, basically. So when it comes to social policy, they agree with liberals. When it comes to economic policy, they tend to agree more so with conservatives, basically. All right, so that's it for lecture for today. Have a great day, Vikings. You can subscribe here and watch another video here or something's probably going on here. And yeah, have a good day, Vikings.